Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
Mrs. Blunden looked carefully at her niece's tired eyes when she came to the breakfast table the next morning. She also noticed Mr. Aylwin's caring way when he stood up to give Florence a chair. He stayed close to her until she smiled and blushed. Mrs. Blunden could not wait for breakfast to end, and as soon as she found a reason to send Mrs. Wilson and the boys away, she started to ask questions sharply. "What is all this, Mr. Aylwin?" "Florence, what is going on?" Florence was very confused and played with her teaspoon. She did not try to answer, but her lover, Mr. Aylwin, replied quickly and clearly. "It means, Aunt Margaret, that I have asked for something very important, and Florence has said yes, but only if you agree." "Will you let me have your Florence?" Mrs. Blunden smiled in a teasing way. "You are very polite, of course. But I know my niece well, and she will do what she wants, no matter what I say. There, don't get red and act like you disagree with me, child. You have the Harriton family temper, like my poor brother, who made many mistakes because of it. Do you think my asking for your niece's hand in marriage is the same as those mistakes?" Mr. Aylwin asked seriously. Florence was upset by her aunt's blunt words, but she smiled at Mr. Aylwin's clever answer. "Of course not," Mrs. Blunden said, just as seriously, but more sincerely. "If I wasn't sure that you are good enough to marry her, I would have taken her away as soon as I thought you liked her. And you don't see any reason to say no to us getting married right away, do you?" Mr. Aylwin asked, without seeming to notice that Florence was embarrassed. Mrs. Blunden raised her eyebrows. "Wow, you are in a big hurry. Please tell me, when did you ask my niece this very important question?" "As her guardian, I think I have the right to know this." "Florence and I have understood each other since last night," he answered, hesitating a little. "Last night. And you want to get married tomorrow?" Aunt Margaret said sarcastically. "Surely, Florence, you don't agree with this. It is really too quick, isn't it?" "My dear Mrs. Blunden," said Mr. Aylwin, speaking before Florence could reply, "if we are sure that we love each other and want to spend our lives together, why wait? Why stop me from wanting to start our new life as soon as possible?" "When did you decide to make Florence your wife?" her aunt asked. "When did you make these important plans?" "I knew I loved her before I went to India," he answered, not directly. Said Mrs. Blunden dryly. "If you are happy to wait all these years, I think you can wait a bit longer for a nice wedding dress to be made for Florence and for all the proper arrangements. What do you say, Florence? Have you promised not to say anything, that you are so quiet?" "I have already asked Mr. Aylwin for more time," Florence said quietly. Mr. Aylwin looked unhappy and a little angry as he answered. "You did, but when I reminded you that this is my first request, I thought you trusted me enough to change your mind." "No," said Mrs. Blunden firmly. "I will not let you marry my niece, because I think of her as my child, if you're going to take her away quickly and secretly, like you are ashamed of something. If you have loved Florence for so long, why didn't you tell me about it sooner?" Mr. Aylwin was silent, and Florence, who had lifted her head to hear what he would say, felt disappointed. "Well, everyone," said Aunt Margaret in a sharp voice as she picked up her gloves and handkerchief, "it looks like I am not going to know more than you want to tell me. And maybe my wishes will not matter after all." "No, dear aunt, no, no," cried Florence. She ran to her aunt and hugged her tightly. "Not because of me, and Mr. Aylwin will not be unreasonable either. You will not be able to say that I did not listen to you, even for his sake. I will do what you want, Aunt Margaret." Tears filled Mrs. Blunden's eyes as she hugged Florence back warmly. She felt better because Florence was being so obedient, and she half sobbed, half spoke. "My dear, it will be so hard to say goodbye to you that I should be allowed to have you with me for a few more weeks. I was never really angry with you, except once, my little Flory, and I have felt sorry for that ever since. I'm sure," she added, crying even more, "when you wrote to me, thanking me so much for sending you £100 and telling me how useful it was and how it helped my poor, foolish brother. I felt that I had been very cruel not to give you what someone else, with more kindness, had given." "By the way," she suddenly asked, "who sent you that money? Was it Mr. Aylwin?" "No, madam," he answered shortly. "Really? And you didn't know anything about it?" For a moment or two, he did not answer. But then he saw Florence looking at him, trying to understand, and he said slowly, "I have a reason to know. I found out by accident that the money sent to Miss Harriton was one of the last things Lieutenant Mason did before he left England." Florence was very surprised. "Is it possible? Heaven forgive me. I judged him more harshly than I should have if I had known that he was sorry for what he did and gave me the money." Mr. Aylwin turned to look out the window without saying anything, but Mrs. Blunden said loudly, "Nonsense. You couldn't think worse of him than he deserved. He only gave you back some of your own money. And now let me go. If this wedding is going to be rushed, like I think it will be even though I don't want it to be, I must go and talk to my maid about the dresses and everything." After she hurried out of the room, Florence quietly walked over to Mr. Aylwin, who was standing sadly. She put her hand on his arm and whispered, "You're not angry with me, are you?" "Why would I be?" he replied. "For trying to see the good in that bad man? I wasn't thinking of him at all. I was thinking of you and what you want." He pulled her close with love. "Were you really? And if Mrs. Blunden can be persuaded, will you promise not to delay? Don't you see that I am eager to take you away, to a brighter land, with new places and people, to forget all the old sad memories that make you look pale and unhappy?" "But I would not forget them completely," said Florence. "In those sad years, I learned lessons that made me more humble, more caring for others, kinder to those who make mistakes, and more compassionate to those who need it." "You look just like your mother, my Florence," he said with admiration. "She would have picked flowers even when there were thorns in her path. And you're right, I know you are, even though I can't be as patient and kind as you are. I still feel angry at those who hurt you, and I get upset about the things that kept us apart for so long. Didn't you say we shouldn't talk about the sad past?" Florence said, feeling worried as she saw his eyes flash and his eyebrows lower. "Yes, love, you're right, I did say that. And we won't talk about it. You're right to stop me. You must always do that, and I will try to be more careful." "And yet," Florence said, trembling a little because she knew she was bringing up a difficult topic, "I think we would both be happier if we were completely honest with each other. I mean, if we had no secrets. But—" "I understand you, Florence," he said, looking very upset, "and I understand why you're saying this. But please, please spare me. I don't have the strength to talk about those painful details. Let's just be happy that our love has never changed, even though life has kept us apart. And it never has it, my Florence? To this, she could truthfully say, no, and he seemed satisfied with her answer. But the old worries were still there, and Florence felt even more that they couldn't be truly happy while there was still something hidden between them. Yet, when he lovingly asked her to promise that she would marry him as soon as Mrs. Blunden would agree, she didn't know how to refuse his passionate request. When he was happy, he was so much like the Frank Dormer she remembered and missed so much. It was only when she was alone for a while and thought about everything he had said that she had to admit the painful truth. There was some important part of his life that he was keeping from her. Something had happened, either something he did or something someone else did, that was always on his mind, making him unhappy and affecting even the joy of their being together again.